Why the German tanker didn't shoot the 24 hours that saved an American lieutenant. August 23, 1944. Kurt Mueller sat in his Panther tank turret. He looked through binoculars at a burning French village. Smoke rose from destroyed buildings. Flames consumed what was left of homes. He was 24 years old. He'd been a tank gunner for 3 years. War had taught him many things. Most of them were about death. The village was called Saint-Germain. It sat between Paris and Chartres. 32 houses had stood there that morning. Now most were rubble. Kurt remembered the smell of fresh bread at dawn. The French baked better than Germans. His commander had joked about it. That was only 8 hours ago. Now the village smelled like burning rubber and death. Kurt had learned not to notice that smell. He'd learned it at Kursk a year before. His crew sat silent in the tank. Hans drove. Wilhelm loaded shells. Fritz worked the radio. Oberleutnant Schmidt commanded. They all knew the war was lost. Nobody said it out loud. Speaking those words meant execution. Even in August 44. Even as the front collapsed. Even as the Allies raced toward the Rhine. Kurt pulled a photo from his pocket. His wife Greta held their son Erich. The boy had turned 3 in June. Kurt had seen him twice in his whole life. A letter from Greta had arrived yesterday. She wrote in pencil on torn notebook paper. They'd moved to her mother's village near Leipzig. Dresden was being bombed. Erich asked when Papa would come home. She didn't ask about victory. She didn't mention the war. She just wanted him alive. She wanted him home. That was all. Kurt had read the letter 8 times. He'd memorized every word. He'd traced the water stains where her tears had fallen. He'd written back with comfortable lies. Schmidt tapped Kurt's shoulder. He pointed toward the village's right side. Something moved through the ruins. Kurt raised his binoculars. He focused. An American jeep crawled between destroyed houses. It was lost. Anyone could see that. 2 men sat inside, a driver and an officer. They'd turned the wrong way. They'd driven into German territory. They didn't realize their mistake yet. Schmidt raised his hand. The signal meant prepare to fire. Standard procedure, easy target, 1 shell, 2 deaths, another entry in the combat log. The American who got lost. Lieutenant James Harrison from Boston knew they were lost. He'd figured it out 5 minutes earlier. He was 23 years old. He'd studied French literature at Harvard before Pearl Harbor changed everything. His driver was Private Tommy Johnson from Texas, 18 years old, farm boy. He'd learned to drive 3 months ago. Tommy turned his head left and right. He looked for landmarks. Nothing helped. Smoke hid everything. Ruins all looked the same. James held a map. The map was useless. Every street looked identical in the rubble. All landmarks had vanished under debris. The compass showed north. That didn't help him understand where they were. He remembered a Harvard lecture about French architecture. Professor Morris had taught him that villages centered on churches, but this church was destroyed. The square was buried in rubble. Tommy stopped the jeep near a half-destroyed house. Stone walls might give them cover. James reached for a larger-scale map from his case. His mother's letter sat in his jacket pocket. Eleanor Harrison lived alone in their Boston house. His father had died of a heart attack in '39. She wrote about pride. She wrote about prayers at St. Paul's Church. She hoped he'd come home by Christmas. She wanted them together for the holidays. She didn't know what he'd seen in France. He didn't write about the nightmares. He didn't mention the bodies. He didn't tell her about learning not to flinch at explosions. Eleanor thought he was still her boy. The one who read Baudelaire in French. The one who wrote poems about sunsets. That boy had died somewhere between Omaha and Saint-Lô. James folded the letter back into his pocket. He told Tommy to turn around. Something felt wrong ahead. Too quiet, too empty, too much destruction for a village in American hands. The moment of choice. Kurt looked through his gun sight at the jeep. It turned slowly, preparing to leave. His finger rested on the trigger. He waited for Schmidt's command. The distance was 450 meters. Perfect range. Almost no wind. Smoke reduced visibility slightly, but the target was large and slow. Missing was nearly impossible. Schmidt raised his hand higher. He prepared to give the fire command. Kurt watched the American officer through his sight. 8-power magnification showed everything clearly. The American pulled something from his pocket. He looked at it. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Kurt saw it was a photo or letter, something personal, something precious. Wind cleared the smoke for a moment. Kurt saw the American's face clearly. Young, tired, dark circles under his eyes, an expression of longing and sadness, the same expression Kurt saw in mirrors. The American folded the paper carefully, exactly how Kurt folded Greta's letter 10 minutes earlier. Carefully, gently, like the most valuable thing in this war. Kurt saw the American's lips move. He said something to his driver, maybe a joke. The driver smiled. That smile was so young, so innocent. Kurt thought of his younger brother Karl. Karl had died at Stalingrad in 42, 19 years old. Schmidt spoke the command, fire, a clear military order. Kurt had obeyed it hundreds of times in 3 years, but his finger didn't move. It froze a millimeter from the metal. It refused to obey. 1 second of silence. 2. 3. Schmidt repeated the command, louder, irritated. He didn't understand why his gunner wasn't shooting. Kurt turned his head toward his commander. He said something he'd never said in 3 years of war. "I can't, sir. I can't shoot this man." Schmidt froze. His face went white. Rage or shock. Kurt couldn't tell which. Schmidt grabbed Kurt's shoulder. He demanded explanations. He demanded immediate obedience. Kurt stayed silent. He looked through his sight at the jeep. It had almost turned completely around. In seconds, it would disappear. It would drive away. It would take that young officer with his letter home to Boston or wherever he came from. Hans and Wilhelm said nothing. They didn't understand what was happening. They didn't dare interfere. They were frozen witnesses to this moment. Schmidt released Kurt's shoulder. He asked quietly, very quietly, "Why, Obergefreiter Mueller? Why do you refuse a combat order in wartime? You know that means execution." Kurt didn't look away from his sight. The jeep was disappearing behind a corner, vanishing into smoke and ruins, leaving history as a target that wasn't shot. He answered slowly. He chose his words carefully. "Because he's just like me, sir. He has a letter from his wife or mother. He wants to go home as badly as I want to see Greta and Eric." Schmidt was silent for a long time. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Then he slowly sat back down in his position. He spoke quietly. "I saw it too, Obergefreiter. I saw him look at that letter. I thought of my wife Martha and daughter Anna in Munich. The story that stayed untold. Tank number 312 didn't report enemy contact that day. The combat log showed routine patrol and no targets. Standard wording for a day without combat. Major Weiss didn't ask questions. By late August 44, quiet days were rare. No losses counted as a blessing. Kurt returned to his gunner routine, checking optics, cleaning the gun, practicing loading drills with Wilhelm. But something had changed inside him, something fundamental and permanent. He started seeing enemies as people, not as targets, not as threats, but as husbands, fathers, sons, men whose families waited for letters, men whose mothers prayed for their return. Just like Greta prayed for him. Schmidt never mentioned what happened at Saint-Germain, not that day, not later, not when they retreated toward the Rhine in September, not when their tank was hit near Arnhem in October. They both knew they shared a secret now, a silent agreement. Some shots didn't need to be made. Some lives didn't need to be taken, even if orders said otherwise. Hans died 2 weeks later. Artillery hit their tank near Nancy. A shell fragment came through his vision slit. It killed him instantly, before he understood what happened. Wilhelm survived until captivity in March 45. Their battalion's remnants surrendered to Americans near Koblenz. Exhausted, starving, out of fuel and ammunition. Understanding the war was over. Understanding they were on the losing side. Kurt went to an American POW camp in Belgium. He spent 8 months there. In January 46, he was repatriated to Germany. He returned to Dresden. The city lay in ruins from the February 45 bombing. He found Greta and Eric alive. They'd stayed in her mother's village near Leipzig. They'd survived the war's end there. Eric didn't recognize his father. A 4-year-old boy didn't remember a man he'd seen twice, but Greta recognized him. Though Kurt had aged 10 years in 3 years of war. His eyes were an old man's eyes. They'd seen too much death. Kurt found work as a watchmaker in Leipzig, a peaceful profession. He'd learned it from his father before the war. Work where precision and attention created life, not destroyed it. He never told Greta about Saint-Germain, about the shot he didn't take, about the American lieutenant with a letter in his pocket, about seeing a human instead of a target. The other side of the story. James Harrison returned to Boston in December 45, 4 months after Japan surrendered, after the war finally ended on all fronts. His mother Eleanor met him at the station. She'd aged and grayed, but she was happy. Her prayers had been answered. Her son came home whole. No visible wounds on his body. The invisible wounds came later: nightmares, insomnia, sudden fear from loud sounds. She saw them when James woke screaming, shouting names of people she didn't know. He didn't return to Harvard. French literature seemed meaningless after what he'd seen in France. Poems about sunsets made no sense to someone who'd seen dawn over fields covered with corpses. James got a job at the Boston Globe. He wrote about local news, city events. He avoided military topics. He didn't want to return to those memories. He married in 47, Margaret O'Connor, an Irish cop's daughter. She worked as a nurse at a veterans hospital. She understood without words what war did to people. They had a daughter in 48, Elizabeth. James tried to be a good father. Sometimes he'd watch his sleeping daughter. He'd think about that day in Saint-Germain, when he and Tommy got lost in smoke and ruins. He didn't know a German tank had them in its sights. He didn't know a finger had frozen on a trigger. He didn't know a commander had already given the fire order, an order that wasn't obeyed. James remembered pulling his mother's letter from his pocket, standing in the jeep in that destroyed village, rereading it. He remembered a strange feeling, like someone was watching him, like eyes were following his every movement. He blamed nerves, fatigue, wartime paranoia, when every bush might hide a sniper, when every house might hide a machine gun. Tommy Johnson returned to his Texas farm. He never mentioned the Saint-Germain incident. For him, it was just a day they got lost and found their way. Nothing special in the war's chaos. James sometimes thought about that day, especially when he couldn't sleep. He wondered why they survived, why no planes attacked, why no artillery came, why no German tanks appeared when they were so vulnerable. He believed in luck, in divine providence, in blind chance, but he didn't believe someone could consciously spare their lives. War left no room for mercy and humanity. Meeting after 40 years. In 1984, Kurt received a letter from a veterans organization. They organized reconciliation meetings between former enemies, German and American veterans who'd fought in the same French locations in 44. Kurt was 64, retired. Greta had died from cancer 2 years earlier. His son Eric lived in West Germany with his family. He rarely visited. Kurt debated whether to attend, whether to stir memories he'd carefully locked away for 40 years, but loneliness won. He bought a train ticket to France. The meeting happened at a small Normandy hotel. About 30 men gathered, Germans and Americans, old men with gray hair and wrinkles, former enemies shaking hands, remembering war with sadness, not hatred. Kurt sat in a corner. He drank coffee. He listened to other veteran stories. Then he heard a familiar name. Saint-Germain. August 23rd, 44. An American was speaking. Early 60s, gray hair, glasses, New England accent. He described getting lost in that village with his driver, barely escaping alive. Still feeling like someone had watched them that day. Kurt froze. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. His heart pounded so hard he thought he'd have a heart attack. He'd die right here, before saying anything. The American finished his story. Other veterans discussed their memories. Kurt stood slowly. He walked toward the man he hadn't killed 40 years ago. He introduced himself. Kurt Mueller, former Panther tank gunner, served with the 352nd Tank Division near Saint-Germain in August 44. The American's head snapped up. His eyes widened behind his glasses. James Harrison, former lieutenant with the 29th Infantry Division, was there at the same time. Got lost with his driver in smoke and ruins. Their voices trembled, their hands too. They both understood something important was about to happen, something fateful. Kurt said what he'd kept silent for 40 years. I saw you through my gun sight. The distance was 450 meters. My commander ordered fire. But I couldn't pull the trigger, because I saw you take out a letter and look at it. And I thought of my wife and son. James stayed silent for a long time. His face went pale. His breathing became uneven. Kurt thought the American might hit him, or turn away. Instead, James extended his hand. They shook hands. Former gunner and former target, German and American. Two old men who could have killed each other 40 years ago, but didn't. James talked about his life after the war, about Margaret, who died from Alzheimer's 3 years earlier, about his daughter Elizabeth. She became a doctor in Chicago, about grandchildren he saw once yearly at Christmas. Kurt talked about Greta. She'd waited for him through captivity. She'd lived with him 38 years until her death. About Eric, he became an engineer, built a good life in the New Germany. About his granddaughter Lisa. She was studying to become a doctor in Berlin. They talked until late. After other veterans had gone to their rooms, they talked about war, about life, about what it means to kill someone or not kill them, about the thin line between hero and murderer, between mercy and cowardice. The price of humanity. Kurt never thought of himself as a hero, more like a soldier who refused an order in one critical moment, because he saw a human where he should have seen a target. He didn't know if he'd done the right thing. That thought had haunted him for 40 years. If he'd shot, maybe one of his comrades wouldn't have died from this American's hand in the next battle. James admitted he'd killed several German soldiers after Saint-Germain, during the Rhine offensive in September and October, doing his duty as an officer, protecting his men, doing what war required. Maybe some of those killed were Kurt's friends, battalion comrades, men he'd shared rations with. They'd never know. Perhaps that was better. Some war details are better left in the past. They agreed to correspond. Two old souls connected by one moment. One shot not taken. One act of mercy in an ocean of cruelty. Kurt returned to Leipzig feeling relieved, like a 40-year burden had lifted from his shoulders, like he'd finally received forgiveness for what he'd considered possible betrayal of duty. He wrote a long letter to Eric. For the first time in 40 years, he told about Saint-Germain, about the shot he didn't take, about the American he spared, about how sometimes the most important shot is the one you don't take. Eric replied briefly but warmly. He wrote that he was proud of his father, that he understood his choice, that in a world with too much killing, every saved life matters, even an enemy's life. James also wrote to his daughter Elizabeth. He told about meeting the German who'd held him in his sights but didn't shoot, about how his entire life after that day existed only because one soldier saw him as human. They corresponded for 5 years, 2 or 3 letters yearly, short messages about life, about grandchildren, about health, about memories. Kurt died in 1989 from a heart attack. He was 69. He died in his sleep, without pain, in his Leipzig apartment. James learned about his death from Eric. He'd found James's address in his father's papers. He wrote that Kurt often remembered their Normandy meeting. He'd considered those 2 days the most important in his life. The day he didn't shoot, and the day he met his target. James traveled to the funeral, a long journey across the Atlantic and Europe. He stood at the grave of the man who'd saved his life, without knowing his name, without expecting gratitude, simply because he'd seen a letter in a stranger's pocket and thought of his own family. Legacy of one shot. The story of Kurt Mueller and James Harrison never made history textbooks, never became a heroic episode in war movies. It remained a personal story of 2 families. Elizabeth Harrison told the story to her children, James's grandchildren, when they asked why Grandpa went to France every August, why he stood at a German soldier's grave. She explained that war isn't just big battles and heroic deeds. It's also small moments of choice, when one person decides to kill or not kill another person, and that choice changes the future forever. If Kurt had pulled the trigger on August 23, 44 at Saint-Germain, James Harrison would have died at 23. No children, no grandchildren, no great-grandchildren, no hundreds of articles written, no long happy life with his beloved wife. Erich Mueller saved all letters his father exchanged with James Harrison. He donated them to the Berlin Reconciliation Museum. They're preserved as evidence that even in war's hell, humanity is possible. Lisa Mueller became a doctor, like Elizabeth Harrison. They met at a Geneva medical conference in 2001. They didn't know about their grandfather's connection. Not until they talked about family history. Two women whose grandfathers could have been enemies became friends. They continued the legacy of mercy and understanding that began that August day in Saint-Germain. The story of one shot not taken created two branches of life, American and German. They intertwined across generations, creating a network of human connections where there should have been only death and oblivion. Every year, on August 23rd, descendants of Kurt Mueller and James Harrison meet in Saint-Germain, in that same village where tragedy almost happened, but miracle occurred instead. They bring flowers to the monument for fallen soldiers of both sides. They stand silent for 1 minute, thinking about how thin the line is between life and death, how one moment of choice can change families' fates for many generations forward. The war ended in 1945, but its lessons continue living in stories of people like Kurt and James, ordinary soldiers who in one critical moment chose humanity over hatred, mercy over revenge, life over death.